As the Scottish Government has abandoned its flagship target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 75% by 2030, after accepting evidence from the Climate Change Committee that this target is out of reach, we are joined here today by Right Honourable Lord Duncan of Springbank. Ian served as the Minister for Climate Change up until 2020 and joined the UK Government as a Scotland Office Minister after the 2017 general election. So Ian is here today to share some valuable insight on this recent event. Thank you so much for joining us, Ian. For our first question, what are your initial reflections on this decision by Scotland to abandon its ambitious target? And in your opinion, what factors contributed to this misjudgment of these targets?
I think the Scottish Government, the target we're talking about is an interim target. So one could argue that their ultimate target hasn't changed. The reality, of course, is if you're not on course to meet the interim target, then the final target is even harder to achieve. I think, if I'm being political for a moment, I do think they were determined to be quite distinct from the UK government and more ambitious than the UK government, which is not a bad thing to be, as long as that ambition is well-founded and sensible. I think what the Climate Change Committee have demonstrated with very clear evidence is that the Scottish Government have not been doing the things required to meet the interim target. And I would imagine, if you look at the CCC's report, it would suggest they would be off track ultimately to meet the final target as well. And they've been very upfront about what the Scottish Government would need to do, where it would need to invest, where it would need to take action, and it hasn't done so. That the Scottish Government themselves now are stepping back from the target is sensible, because quite clearly it can't be met. And that's just a simple state of truth. But it does mean that a lot of the rhetoric around this is problematic, because there was a lot of condemnation when Rishi Sunak appeared to be stepping away from some of his targets. But in truth, again, if you look at Chris Stark's comments and the Climate Change Committee's work, they were noting that Rishi Sunak was being more political in his statements, but his commitments remained remarkably solid. So, for example, in electric vehicles, what you were seeing was that the zero electric mandate was broadly being maintained, even although what appeared to be a big change had been announced. But actually, if that mandate was maintained, we were still going to be on target to meet the ultimate ambition of the government. It's the other way around for the Scottish government right now. So two things I think I would take from this. The first is rhetoric is meaningless. It's politicization in an election year. You have to look at the delivery mechanisms, the ability to meet the ambition that you have set yourself, and how you fund it. And the easiest way to tell if you're going to do it is look at the funding. So I do quite a bit of work in forestry, and they cut the support for forestry substantially, but as part of their targets, they had a very clear planting target. Well, it was impossible to meet if you cut the funding for planting, and therefore you have to dial back on what would be the ultimate outcome of that proposal. So I think the Scottish Government have done the right thing, which is admit that they cannot meet those targets, but now they have to explain what they will do to double down on the ultimate targets, because they're now going to have to show, by commitment of time, effort, and money, how, let's say, a misstep on the interim target does not in any way interrupt the ultimate target. And that still requires a level of commitments which the Scottish Government have not yet been willing to truthfully adhere to and agree to.
Yeah, great. Well, actually, that leads me straight into my second question, which was looking ahead. What are the steps that the Scottish Government do you think they'll take? But just continuing on that, how do you think that this decision has impacted public opinion and public sentiment? I know you touched upon that briefly in your last answer, but if you can elaborate, that would be great.
It's early days. I think it will be used by political opponents to demonstrate or to suggest the Scottish Government's commitment is lackluster or simply just not true, and that is politics being played in the raw. What I think it ought to do is ensure that those opposition parties in Scotland now ask the right questions. If you cannot meet the interim targets, what are the measures you will implement to ensure the ultimate target is met? What are the funding commitments you will make? What are the ultimate reconfigurations of your approach, which must be implemented to hit those final targets, because it's one thing to say we shall not meet the interim targets, but of course we'll meet the final targets. But the final targets are some way away. The measure of the trajectory is 2030. You can see it's coming. If you hit that, then the line of progress the trend is established. So I think the Scottish Government have a lot of explaining to do, because a number of their policies, if you look at the CCC report, the report isn't just an arm-waving exercise. It looks in detail at each of the elements of the Scottish Government's overall commitment. And it says where there are challenges, ultimately where the Scottish Government needs to change its approach. And thus far, the Scottish Government have set aside the interim targets, but have not in any way supplied the material, the information, the new targets, one might say, that people need to know to ensure that this is deliverable. Now, to put capital P politics into this, I suppose the challenge for the Green Party is, what are they for in the coalition? Because one would hope they are there to keep the Scottish National Party true on environmental commitments. And if they cannot do that, they will have to explain why not, and what they're intending to do to make sure that the Scottish National Party, the main player in the coalition, ultimately hits the targets. And they may yet to do that. This is just being announced in the last few days. So the test of the Green Party simply is, what will you now do with your coalition partner to ensure that, having abandoned the interim target, that you are still on course and the trajectory is still sure for you to hit the ultimate target? And they need to be able to explain that in a way which I would have thought appeals to their would-be supporters, because ultimately, if you're a Green Party, you have to be a little bit green, ultimately.
Yeah.
And if they are unable to do that, then the electorate ultimately will make a decision, which is, you're not green enough, and we therefore we don't believe you can deliver.
So Mari McCallan suggested that Westminster's mismanagement played a role in Scotland's inability to meet its climate targets. To what extent do you agree with this assessment, and what actions do you think that Westminster should take in response to this?
Well, I think it's nonsense. I suppose that's the simple statement. The Climate Change Committee have set out exactly what the Scottish Government need to do to meet its targets. I suppose the important thing is when that very ambitious target was set, it was beyond where the Climate Change Committee said they needed to be in those intervening years. So, in truth, the Scottish Government set its own target to achieve that, fully aware of the constraints they faced in terms of the constitutional settlement and so forth. That can't have come as a surprise to them, because, frankly, it was well established. And the Climate Change Committee didn't set the target for them. They suggested how they might want to look at the reality of what they were trying to do by 2050, but the 2030 target was simply not a construct of the Climate Change Committee. So I think for the Scottish Government to try and now blame the UK government, I think, is passing the buck. Now, there is a truth to say that their ambitious target was set without reference to the UK government's target, because they set a target, a more ambitious target than had been suggested by the Climate Change Committee, and the UK government accepted the Climate Change Committee's overall advice and followed it within that constraint, and the Scottish Government chose to go beyond it in a more ambitious way. But they knew they were doing that, so you can't very well blame the UK government for having a more ambitious target beyond where the UK government said it could be, and then say it's all the fault of the UK government. So I think, and this will be the challenge for the Scottish government, almost all the policy levers are in there, but I think all the policy levers are ultimately in their hands in this area, and the choice they make about how to pull those levers will be how you hit the targets. So in the one area that I've been doing some work in, on forestry, wholly devolved, wholly funded by the Scottish Government. They cut the budget for tree planting substantially. You can't therefore expect the same number of trees to be planted with less money, and therefore that element of the overall ambition has to be reassessed, because quite simply you're not investing in the ability to hit the target. So you can blame Westminster for that if you want, but you've made choices. And those choices are not easy, because this is going to get progressively harder for every country in the world. But you need to be able to balance out your overall ambition with truth and deliverability within the constraints that every country faces, full stop. And that's the challenge that the Scottish Government has to embrace wholeheartedly. If they come along and say it's all really because of Westminster, I think they will do a disservice to their own ambitions, to their own abilities. And I think ultimately they would be criticised rightly by the Climate Change Committee hereafter for playing politics with what quite evidently is a series of, let's call them domestic choices made by the Scottish Government, which are within their ability to make. And whether those are cash choices or priority choices, those are ultimately theirs to make.
Yeah, great. And on that point about countries around the globe, ahead of COP, how do you think policymakers and governments around the world can use this experience to inform their future climate action plans effectively?
I think the COP challenge is a real one because, let's say there's fair weather COP and there's bad weather COP in this context. When everything is going well, when the global economy is settled and stable, when people are able to predict and to invest on the basis of a stable landscape, then you can make very clear and sure statements and choices. But we haven't had that for some time. COVID itself was an extraordinary disruption. Ukraine is an extraordinary disruption. The Middle East situation is an extraordinary disruption, making everything much more difficult. And underpinning a lot of the ability to make change is a confidence of business, of commerce, of industry, because a lot of the targets that we talk about being met by government are ultimately met by the wider sectors who compose the economic base of a nation. And they require a whole range of things to be able to be workable, including their ability to make a profit, their ability to understand upcoming challenges, their ability to understand the market. And so we're now, having had a number of years of, and I'm using the word fair weather COP, good COP, we're about to enter bad COP, because right now, I'm afraid it's a much tougher environment. And so a lot of these targets will be reassessed, I imagine, in light of more substantial challenges, economic challenges. And as we saw with the Scottish Government's choice, yes, they could have reconfigured their entire basis to ensure those targets were met, but they didn't. And other nations will do the same when confronted by something similar. It's very hard, particularly in an election year, to say to people, actually, we shall make different choices and ultimately cuts and, one might argue, restrictions to other parts of our policy offering in order to prioritize climate change. And I think what we're witnessing now, and this is why it's definitely bad COP, is a number of nations are now looking at their commitments and saying, yes, but not now, or yes, but not this way, or yes, but perhaps after the election. And the problem is that the climate challenge is not wedded to a political timetable. And the challenge that you face ultimately as a politician is how, therefore, do you ensure you get elected, whilst also making very clear to those who would vote for you that you have commitments which are above and beyond the normal political discourse, because they feature in a bigger, painful recognition that the planet is challenged in a range of climatic ways. And, it's very easy to try and look at all the issues affecting the globe and saying, we can manage, but actually, even just as we saw with the situation in Dubai, for example, gosh, no, I'm not quite clear exactly what happened there or what is going to happen there, but that's unusual. And let's not say it's all about climate change. Let's just say that's an unusual element that has happened here, and we need to understand it better. But there have been an awful lot of unusual elements in terms of climatic changes, and we need to make sure that we are, as best we can, marshalling our resources carefully to ensure that people are willing to vote for those who are still advocating serious climate change commitments. Because if you can't do that, ultimately, you will win an election but be unable to deliver against your targets, as we're seeing with 2030 in the Scottish government context.
Yeah, so being realistic, I guess. Yeah, thank you so much, Ian. That was really insightful.